Thank you, too. We have a scripture reading, John 3:16. I'll try to speak it from the memory. For God so loved the world that he gave the only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have an everlasting life. Amen. With that, I'd like to introduce Burk Heimann. You know him, some may not. He's going to give us the message for today. Thank you.
It was a neat song to hear. Always fun to watch the kids going back and forth a few times. I used to always say when we were years ago, just keep going. As long as the person stands up, they keep going. It's the Lord wants to give us the freedom of learning generosity. Such a thing. We've lost so much freedom. And he wants to give it to us back, and so we're thankful again that we're here this morning. Now, today, Benjamin is going to give his testimony. But I thought, as I'm sitting up here, I thought to myself, it's always fun to watch, interesting to watch how God works. See, we're here, when we open the Bible, we read how God works in the lives of people and how he does it. And being that God is seeking everyone and searching for them and loves them, I thought maybe we'd just do something. Dave, I know I didn't say anything to you, but come up here for a sec. I want you to just kind of tell your side of the thing a little bit, because Luke was doing Luke and Dave were building a building at Shercroft. And so I'll just give you a little background in here. So how did you meet, or what happened here? How did God work here to get you to hook up with Benjamin?
To meet Benjamin?
Yeah.
Well, that is an interesting story, for sure. Anyways, yeah, we were working on the Shercroft fees, Luke and I and Cody. And every morning we would pray. We would stand on the scaffold, might be on the ground, up on the scaffold, maybe by the mixer, and we would pray, Lord, bless the guys here today. Bless us in our work, because we're just human, and we need protection, and we need help. So we'd pray. And so it was the second week we were working at Shercroft, and Benjamin, he was driving the forklift, working, bagging feed, and anyways, he came walking by where I was laying blocks, and he said, you know what, Dave? He said, oh no, he didn't know my name. He just said, you know what we should do? He said, we should put some windows in this building here. And then we could put some bars, and I said, and I'm looking at him and I said to him without even thinking, I said, yeah, and you'd feel right at home. Like, where did that come from? You remember that, Benjamin, eh? The Lord took that away. I was like, what the world's going on? Anyway, so I said to him, I'm sorry, I shouldn't assume that, that you've been in jail. Anyway, but then he said to him, funny you say that though, because I have been in jail. He said, I'd go with my dad, and we'd do Bible studies. His dad would do Bible studies in jail, in the prison. I said, no way. I said, well, I would go with my dad too. I said, we got something in common. My dad was a pastor, and he would go to do prison ministries, and I would go with him. So anyways, we're having this conversation there on the job site, and I'm thinking, wow, this is weird. Like, we have something in common here, And anyways, we got back to work, and then later on the day, he said to me, he said, well, where do you go to church? And I said, well, I go to Silver Hills Church and Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he's like, oh, okay. I said, yeah, well, I've been searching, and I'm kind of coming back. He said, I'm just kind of, on a bit of a journey. And I said, oh, that's neat. Anyways, he said, but you said a word. He said, you said rejoice. And I don't remember saying rejoice. You heard me say rejoice, but I didn't say rejoice. But that's okay, the Spirit. That's and he said, that's King James. He said, that's King James Version. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's true. Anyway, so it was kind of cool. Anyways, I went home that night, And I was telling Carl about meeting Benjamin, and then I said, I just feel impressed. I got to give him a Bible. I need to take a Bible. Anyway, so then I had a Bible at home and an extra Bible, and I brought it the next day. And then on the job, I said, hey, Benjamin, brought you something today. I said, brought you a Bible. Anyways, we had a little prayer and talked, and then he shared with me how he was actually going to be a minister. It was after in high school, right? Just out of high school, maybe? A little after high school. And I said, well, I just prayed that the Lord would bless him as he read his word again and get back in the word. So anyway, that's my connection with Benjamin, and I'm just thankful that he's here today and going to share. So praise the Lord.
Yeah. So that's kind of neat. Interesting how this Spirit has you say things sometimes that are even shocking to you. Anyway, Benjamin, come on forward. We'll have you give your testimony. We're looking forward to it. I'm going to come down and listen to first.
Well, I remember that mostly the same, with a few different details, but I'll tell you my side in a minute. But thanks for sharing that. It's interesting to how we remember things from our own perspective, and the essence of it was absolutely right, though. I didn't remember him saying that I'd feel at home. I do now. I recall you saying that, but I'd forgotten all about that part. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Benjamin Dick is my last name. I was the ugly crier in the back seat about 5 weeks ago, something like that. I think I was here for the first time. So I would not have imagined being up here now. But here I am. So I guess we'll do our best to share my story. When Burk asked me if I would be willing to share, he asked about how long this would take, and I said, well, probably maybe 15 minutes. And then as I got to preparing, I'm like, this is way longer than 15 minutes. So I'm like, I better warn him. So he said, well, I'll let you go first, which was not my plan, but here we are. There was a scripture in the book of Mark that I want to start with, Mark chapter 11 and verse 6. And this is the Bible that David gave me. I've been absolutely enjoying, loving it. It's a New Living Translation, which for me is refreshing because I grew up on the King James Version, and it's a wonderful version and maybe superior. I don't know. We always considered it to be superior. Of course, we were very proud of our ability to read the King James Version. But beginning to read it in a different translation has allowed me another perspective. And I think had I gone back to reading the King James Version, it would have been too easy to put the lens on it that I always had growing up. So this has been refreshing to read it differently. Anyway, Mark chapter 11, and I'll start in verse 4. Well, it's where Jesus is asking the disciples to go find a young donkey for, of course, his triumphal entry. Verse 4, the 2 disciples left and found the colt standing in the street, tied outside the front door. As they were untying it, some bystanders demanded, what are you doing untying that colt? And they said what Jesus had told them to say. And they were permitted to take it. And I'm just going to stop there. And this is a bit of an odd scripture maybe, but that phrase, they said what Jesus told them to say, I think is what really stood out to me in this scripture. It would have been easy to maybe come up with a more logical argument, or maybe talk to the farmer and say, hey, we're following this guy, his name's Jesus, you might have heard of him, maybe not, he wants this donkey for something he's doing, and go into a big old explanation. And yet when they said simply what Jesus had told them to say, the farmer permitted it. So that was powerful to me, and my prayer today, and I think we'll bow our heads for a moment of prayer, but that Jesus would have his way, that what I say is exactly what Jesus wants me to say, and nothing more, nothing less, but just that. So let's pray for a quick minute. Father God, we're thankful for this opportunity to share, and thank you for this body of believers that you've led me to and that have been supportive and helpful and shown your love in all of this, and I appreciate that. And I ask that you bless my lips and may I speak only the words that you would have me to say. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I brought some Kleenex in preparation for this today because I figured this could be an ugly cry moment again, sadly. I'm a crier, I'll tell you. I'm not necessarily ashamed of it, but it is a lot. It's a burden to carry. In an age where men aren't really that cryable, I feel like maybe it is important for men to cry and to see men cry. So it's okay. But I will get through this. As I was preparing this, I really just, I began to write things down, and then I would start over again because I'm like, oh, I didn't do that part of this part. So I think I may not go on my notes as much as I had expected to, and I just trust that I'll just tell my story. But I wanted to start with, and I was planning to start with the story of Sherkrop. And just before that, I think it was before the prison conversation, the day before or something like that, I had said something about the weather to this guy. I didn't know who he was. They were just contractors working for all I knew, and I didn't know they were Christian, or I just didn't really pay them much attention. I was very focused on my work and didn't really care what was going on. But I said something about the weather because it had gotten a bit cloudy. And I said, oh, I don't know. Like, I noticed they always stopped work when it rained too much. So I thought maybe this might be a bad sign for them. And David said, oh, no. He said, if the weather stays like this, we rejoice. And I thought, okay, that's a very odd choice of words to use. Not most people would use that word. That's not really common. It's more like, this is great. We love this weather. You know, that's more construction type of work with other expletives thrown in. And so it was interesting how one little word could really just open that door. And I said to him after, I said, that's a King James word for sure. Like, that sounded King James to me. But I've noticed it's also in the New Living Translation, so it's not only King James, it's also in this one. But that's how that began. And then, yeah, we had that prison conversation. Well, because they were putting up these gray cinder block walls, and it's kind of, I don't know if you've seen Sherkrop or if you're familiar with the structure of the building, but the middle of it had a big open space, and now there's the gray cinder block walls they built up for a new boiler and electrical room and such. And my boss had been joking, which is kind of what brought the idea to my mind. He's like, oh, I'm going to get you guys orange coveralls, and we're going to put bars on the windows, and this will be great. So that was the joke I was making to David, and I'd forgotten that he said I'd feel right at home. But I was actually trying to remember how it came about, so thank you. And then I mentioned that about my dad doing Bible studies, and then he did too, and I was like, wow, that's, of all the years that I've ever shared that story, no one has ever said to me that their dad did the same thing. That's not a common thing, I think, that most people find themselves doing, is having prison Bible studies. But I did some of that in Bible college myself. I did some of the prison ministry as well. So, yeah, that was that story. Now, when he gave me this Bible, I wasn't hesitant to receive it. Actually, I felt good about receiving it. But I know in times past, over the past several years, people have offered me Bibles, and I've always, no, that's not at all what I wanted to get back to, because I'll just be honest with you folks. But when I was, I think it was in 2020, I officially threw my Bible in the dumpster. I had a thing, and I would carry it with me everywhere I went. I should start at the beginning, but I'm starting here, I guess. So basically, from the time that I stopped going to church, which was pretty much back in 2008 for the most part, I carried it with me. It was my big Thompson Chain Reference, King James Version, leather-bound preacher Bible, which I was very proud of. And of course, in church and stuff, I'd always have my big Bible with me. And I think it was a point of pride for me. But I'd always have it with me. And one morning I woke up in 2020, and for some reason I saw it laying in the bottom drawer of my dresser, and I just thought, nah, this is enough. You know, I've moved on. I had very much my own spiritual beliefs of myself being God, and a lot of very just misled and erroneous beliefs, but they were what I'd kind of picked up along the way of being away from God, which I think is interesting, is as the more, for myself, the more that I left that foundation of the Bible, I just picked up all these random little things along the way that just became my spirituality. And it was a very mixed up cluster of beliefs, but nonetheless, I felt somewhat comfortable with it, I suppose. So that morning, I took my Bible out it was garbage day. I took my Bible out and just dropped it in the dumpster. And I remember looking down at it and just thinking just how it seemed more powerless somehow in the dumpster. And I moved on from that day, and I carried even that with me as a point of pride, because I felt like that was overcoming something from my past, which in a sense it was. I feel like, in a sense, I don't recommend throwing your Bible away, by the way. This is not what this is about. But for me, I believe there was a sense of which it was a letting go of the control that religion, not Christianity, but religion had on me for most of my life. So whether I should or should not have done that remains to be seen. But God's forgiven me, just so you know, and given me a new Bible. So thank you to David for that. I appreciate it. But he gave me that Bible that morning at Surecrop, and I thought that would be it. But then he wanted to have a prayer, and I'm like, oh, I'm at work here. I don't know. I'm looking around to make sure there's no coworkers too close by. But we had a prayer, and then I took my Bible. I took this all the way around the far side of the building just to make sure no one might see me, and went to my car and stuck it in there, real private like, and tried to be all police about it. But since then, that's changed. I've had some great conversations at work, actually, with coworkers about different things related to the Bible, and God's given me a boldness to speak more. But I started reading, this is where I started to go, was Psalm 63, and we don't have to turn there, but in the very first verse, that was kind of where I started to read. It says, "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you." And I was struck by the fact that David says, "God, you are my God." And I'm like, oh, how does he know that God is his God? How has it become so personal for him that he can say, "God, you are my God"? And that phrase, "my God," of course, has been something of an expletive, and for me in my life as well for many years. I was told by a priest one time years ago that it was okay to use that as a swear word, essentially. That was fine because God knows that you're not doing it in a bad way. That was his basic explanation, which I accepted without question. But then what I noticed in my life is when I began to use that phrase, then I always thought, I just won't use Jesus' name. But that eventually broke down as well, and so that became a curse word as well. So the breakdown, and again, I think getting away from Scripture and walking your own path, that breakdown happens so slowly and so incrementally that you always have good reasons for it along the way, and you don't really consider yourself a bad person or lost or deceived. And the thought would cross my mind because I was taught a lot about deception growing up. But those things started filtering into my life in a big way. And as I read this, that morning, I take my Bible down to the river. I live close to the Shuswap River, and as I read that, I was so struck by that, how David was so sure that God was his God. And thankfully, since then, I've had that experience myself, and now have absolute certainty that God is my God, my Creator. And that's a beautiful thing. And getting back to the Word has been transformational, to say the very least. So let me start at the beginning of my life, I suppose. I grew up in a highly religious denomination, a Christian church. It was Mennonite. I think there are some around here, actually, and my point of all this story is not to knock them at all. There's no disrespect intended. It was just my experience in this religion. We were part of what was kind of slang term was the white caps. There was black caps and white caps, and we were the white ones. So there's definitely still people of that denomination. I believe there's a church in Salmon Arm, maybe, and somewhere around the area. But I grew up in that environment, and very, very much church-focused, very much God-focused growing up. A lot of Sunday school, a lot of church. So the knowledge that I grew up with was quite extensive, it felt like. But for me, it was starting from a young age. I remember as early as 8 years old being thoroughly ingrained in fear, and the heavy fear that Jesus was coming back. And it was when Amy was telling the story, actually, it's kind of interesting. I sort of could relate to that. And as a young child, I remember hearing, and I'd always kind of listen to the adults' conversation. Usually my dad, I was going to say my parents, but my dad was very heavily into end times and revelations and the rapture and the tribulation and where did pre-trib fit in and post-trib and all these things. There was a lot of conversation surrounding that, which of course in my young mind, I took very, very seriously, and I'd be playing with my friends, but I could kind of hear their conversations, and I'd feel very afraid, essentially, of this whole situation, and it was just a lot to take in. And I remember from about 8 years old, I would lay awake at nights just being in utter terror that Jesus would come back and I would not be ready to meet him. And it was I feel like the way that I perceived what was taught, because I imagine this is not the intention, I'm sure, but the way I perceived it as a little boy was very much, you do bad, God doesn't like you, you do good, God likes you, very black and white. And we made sure in that church to do everything good. We made sure that everything in the Bible we did it because we didn't want to be left behind. Fair enough. That seems like a terrifying thing, but there was a lot of I would think legalism, I guess would be the word. So I embraced that all as a young boy, and I desperately wanted to be right. And so every time I do catch myself doing one little wrong thing or saying one little wrong word or whatever, I would imagine that God would erase my name. That would be it for me. I'd have to go repent, and then God would write it back in. So I always think God used up a lot of pencils in my young age because the eraser got used a lot. But then he'd write it back in. So it was very. It's humorous in a way now, but at the same time, I feel like very somewhat traumatic, and gave me, I feel like, a very wrong perception of who God was, and it was very much a man-made perception of who God was. And again, not blaming the denomination. That is, everyone decides for themselves what they'll do and what they believe. But for me as a child, that's how I perceived it. So growing up that way, I really, my focus and concern was very much always to make sure I was right with God. I didn't have much else on my mind as a kid. And I remember reading or hearing in the Bible how it said Jesus will come when you're not thinking about it. So I would make sure to think about it constantly. Because if you think about it, he can't come back. So I was tricking Jesus. I'm like, I got you. I know this game. I can do this one. Or another one was, if you're in a church service, he can't come back. So as much as I didn't always enjoy church, it was nice because you knew Jesus wouldn't come back during that period of time anyway. You had some free time. It was just nice. You could breathe for a second. So we had in that church what was called revival meetings, and I don't know if you're familiar with that term. You probably are. And for us, the traditional revival meeting looked a bit like a preacher would come from another area, and he'd spend a week doing a week of meetings. Every night they'd have church, and then at the end of the service there would be what later I understood as an altar call. We didn't have an altar. We just had, they would sing a song, and if you wanted to accept Christ, you would stand to your feet, and then the preachers would pray with you afterwards, and you would accept Christ and go from there. Well, as an 8-year-old, and then we were taught this should happen between, from 13, 14, that's when it should happen is what we were taught. So as an 8-year-old, I thought, well, I kind of would like that to happen now because I really would like to not be, found wanting. And so I remember responding in the revival meetings that fall. My birthday's September, so I turned 8. So it would have been right after I turned 8. And the preachers took me downstairs with my parents, and we had prayer. But they said, you're too young, so you just make sure you just obey God or just obey your parents, and that's good. So I was like, okay, well at least I tried, even if I didn't feel like I got to do the thing. I didn't really get to actually say the prayer and do that, but I thought I'd done my best. At least I did what I could. So that had to be okay with God for now until I was 13. So that became my goal then from the ages of 8 to 13. I was like, okay, 13 is it. 13 is, I have to wait till I'm 13 and then I can get right with God, finally. And that was okay. I think it helped relieve some of the stress anyway, and helped me to be able to sleep again at nights a little bit more. Where was I going with this? Yeah, so that was essentially it, I guess, until I was 13. But before I was 13, I was given a bike from my parents. And until then, I'd had hand-me-down bikes. I come from a family of 8 kids, so I was the 4th of 8 kids. And so I was always getting the hand-me-down stuff. And the elder 3 children were girls, were my sisters. So I always was getting girl bikes, and I could never have a boy bike with the bar that goes straight across. It was always the bar that slopes downward, and that was just not cool enough for me and my friends. So I was finally given a bike with the bar that went straight across, and I was so proud of this bike. And the reason I bring that up, because the bikes on the bike, the word or the name, I guess, of the bike, or maybe it was the company, I guess, whatever it's called, the name, whatever that is. Can't remember what the word is. No, I remember the word. I just can't remember why the reason for the word. The word was vagabond. That was the name of the bike, I guess. I don't know. But I just remember seeing vagabond, and I loved words, always as a kid. I always wanted to know what every word meant that I saw. So I had to go look that word up. And I've never forgotten. I read that word and I thought, oh, a vagabond. I don't know if I like that. Like, that's just this wandering person who does whatever, which is exactly what I became. So I've always remembered my bike and the prophetic word of being a vagabond. That's definitely what I was. Maybe still am. But anyway, so finally 13 rolls around, and our family decided to take a family trip that summer. The summer before I turned 13, we took a trip all the way across Canada. My mom was from near Winnipeg, so we would go visit our relatives there, and then we'd go down to Pennsylvania, and that's where our headquarters of our church were. And we'd visit all these different Mennonites, and we used to call it Mennoniting our way across the country, because you stay at all these different families' houses, and they put you up, and it was fun. I think we were gone for about 2 months, but that whole 2 months, I was like, okay, September. Like, the revival's coming, and I get to do it for real this time. And looking back, I think there was a lot of that was based in a true desire to serve God and to be a Christian. I've always, back then, found my identity in it very fully. But there was also, I feel like, so much fear driving that decision. And it wasn't so much trusting Christ as much as, okay, I've crossed my T's and I've dotted my I's and I'm good now. Like, finally I can breathe. So we get back home from our trip, and revivals come around, and sure enough, like, I didn't do it the first night because I thought that felt desperate. So I thought I'd wait until, which I was, but I don't know why it mattered. But I waited until somewhere during the week, I can't remember which night, but then I did my whole standing thing in prayer and got saved, and that was a huge relief for me. But interestingly enough, I found that my problems didn't go away. The issues that I thought I was having, or my things that were sins and such, they never really seemed to necessarily go anywhere. But I got to where they had a special coat that you wore once you became a Christian. I don't know if you've seen Mennonite men. They wear a suit coat it's like a lapel coat, but they get it re-sewn so that it folds forward and has a little divot on the top. So that was a very big deal as a young Mennonite boy to be able to wear the coat and sit in the front of the church, and a lot of different things that you then got to sort of be a part of, which was good. It made me feel a part, like everything was, I was a part of it. But then through my teenage years, and this one more thing. So when I was 13, then after I got saved, I was so full of confidence and so this was great. This was the best thing that ever happened to me. My sister and I, my next older sister, we were washing the dishes one day, and I clearly remember this moment as being one of my most foolish moments of my life. But we were washing dishes, I was drying, she was washing, and I told her, I said, I think now I know everything that there is to know. I think I've got it, and I'm good. I finally figured this all out. I think if I would have said if I know everything that I need to know, I think that might have been better. But I felt like I knew everything that there was to know. And the rest of my life from that moment on has proven me very, very wrong. And the older I get, the more wrong wow, yeah. So if you're 13, you don't know everything that there is to know. You know a lot, and you know everything you need to know, but not everything there is to know at all. But as my teenage years moved on, let me step back. So when you get saved in that church, the next step is baptism, logically. But what baptism is tied to in that denomination is church membership. So I don't know how it is here, but this is just how it was there. So basically, you have to go through an instructional course, which shouldn't take more than a year generally. And then you get baptized, and then you're a church member, and then you participate in communion and become a full-fledged member in good standing, as they would call it. But for us, I was part of a group of 4 boys all through school, actually. There was actually 5 of us boys, but there was 4 in my class. And we were always good friends. We were always hanging out. And we all, except for one, we all got saved, I think, during that revival meeting, or we all did the standing up thing. And so then we got to start instruction class, but we weren't very good boys all the time. So it took us more than 4 years to complete this course, because we kept doing things that would get us in trouble. Like, we would go to an amusement park, and then we'd have to do a little stand-up in church and confess that we had sinned. Or they caught me in a hotel swimming pool one time having a swim, and so I had to stand up and do a confession for that. There's a lot of rules, a lot of things, and again, sorry if I don't mean for this to sound bad, but there's a lot of rules. It don't stop. So I had a lot of trouble trying to get to the point of being worthy of being baptized and becoming a church member. And to me, it broke apart the meaning of what baptism really was and what it truly stands for. For me, it became a very separate issue. It just became, oh, this is my next step. This is the next logical thing to do in this church. And that was my whole life. I didn't know anything else. We had our own school, so we weren't in a public school or anything. We just had our own school in the basement of our church. There was about 40 students, I think, in total, usually, grades 1 through 10. And so it was I didn't know anything other than that. So it just people, I mean, sometimes I'd have cousins that would look at me strange because they weren't like us. My parents actually left their respective religions the summer before that I was born and joined this English-speaking Mennonite church. My parents both attended German-speaking Mennonite churches before. And actually, both of my grandfathers were in their respective churches. They were ministers in those places. So for my parents to leave, I reflect back on that now. For my parents to leave their religions would have been a challenge for sure. But I believe what drove the decision was the fact that this church had the school, and my dad then at that point, when I was born, that was their fourth child, and so that gave them a school to send their kids to as opposed to public school, which is the other option. And so I don't blame him for that. I think given that perspective, it was a wise decision to make. I'm thankful I didn't grow up in a public school. That I see it now, and it just horrifies me. Of course, it was different then, but not that much different. And so it was very much, that was my whole world. And one of the big things for me in my teens was music. I loved music. We'd go to my my mom's side. This is a bit of a discrepancy, and I'm not sure how this worked. I didn't know then how it worked. I still don't know how it worked. But in my mom's side, there was a lot of music. She had several brothers who were in their own little band, and so we'd have family gatherings at Christmas, and they'd bring out their instruments, and I just got to hear them, which just blew my mind because we didn't have instruments growing up. It was a cappella only, and so you couldn't, even the music you listened to on recordings had to be a cappella, generally 4-part harmony. So instruments to me were this whole world of what are they? And they sounded incredible. And to hear someone play the piano, and it would just be like I was in heaven. It was incredible. And but then we'd go to my dad's side. This is the discrepancy. We'd go to my dad's side family gatherings, and they also had music, but they were a bit more, my dad's side was a bit more, they weren't as conservative. Mom's side still was more conservative, and they'd sing hymns, but my dad's side were a bit more rowdy. And they'd get into other stuff. So when the instruments came out on Dad's side, we had to go home. So then we left. We didn't get to see those ones, which I was always really frustrated by. I really wanted to hear them play. But whatever the case, I begged my dad for something my whole teenage years. I wanted either a piano or a guitar. I wanted music. And he said, well, if you can get the bishop to agree, you can talk to the bishop, and if he says yes, then you can do it. Because unbeknownst to me, I never knew this until I was maybe 4 years ago. My dad was a great musician, still is. He picked up a mandolin a couple of years ago at a family gathering, and he played it. And I just, wow, like he hadn't played all those years, and he could still, anyway. So clearly he had a musical connection that he had separated from in order to be part of this church. So I'd talk to the bishop, I'd go to the bishop, I'd arrange a meeting, and I was just, 14, 15 years old. I'd arrange this meeting with the bishop, and I'd say, please, can I have a piano? Actually, back then it was more piano. I loved the guitar too, but I really loved the piano. And he said he would laugh. He'd like, no, you're so funny. Like, you're such a funny little boy. You think? He's like, before you know it, you'll be playing rock music. So no, we can't do that. So that was frustrating. But then I'd go home. But what that drove me to then was a life of deception, frankly, because I would go I'd go to the Christian bookstore. I didn't care so much whether the music was, I loved Christian music. It wasn't the issue. But I'd go to the Christian bookstore and I'd buy some kind of a, Gaither vocal band or something Southern gospel generally. And I'd hide it under my bed, and I'd listen to it, and I'd feel so guilty because it was bad, and so I'd throw it away a few days later. The money that Christian bookstore made on me that I have nothing to show for is tremendous. Like, as soon as I got a job and had a vehicle, it was buying and throwing away every couple of days. I'm serious. It was quite, I even thought of it then. I thought, wow, like I'm buying a lot of stuff just to throw it in the dumpster a few days later because I'm guilty now. But it was the way it was. And I had friends that were doing the same thing. And once we had vehicles, then we actually had a Shania Twain CD that we were in love with. And we would hide it in the yellow pages. He had a big phone book in his truck, and we'd hide the CD inside the yellow pages, and we'd listen to it. And one night we're out camping, and we assume no one's around, of course. You're out in the middle of nowhere camping, and we open the truck doors, and Shania Twain is going. It sounds silly, I know, but this is how it was. The preachers actually thought she was called Shania Twain. They would preach against the evils of Shania Twain music. And I remember thinking, they're so funny, they don't know how to say her name. But anyway, so we turn on Shania Twain. We're having a good time. We weren't drinking. I never drank until I was 28 years old. So no drinking. We weren't smoking. We were just listening to music. That was enough for me. I didn't care. I just wanted music. But then next thing you know, we look up and hear a deacon and his brother come walking into our campground, and we're like, oh no, this isn't good. And of course I guess they were camping down the other side of the lake or something. They'd seen us drive by, and then they heard the music, and so they came over to investigate what awful evil was happening over here. So we had to put that in the campfire. That had to go in the fire, and we had to put on some Christian music. But at this point, our cover's blown. So I think it was a pop-up. I'm not sure we had a meeting with the preachers I don't know what all happened in response to that. But music was for some reason, a very strict thing. And for me, I loved music, and I just wanted more and more of it. So when my sister, my next older sister that I referred to earlier, at one point we were probably about 17. I was 17. She would have been 19. I don't know, maybe 15 and 17. I don't know. She was 2 years older than me anyway. But we decided we were just gonna leave the church. We'd have enough of this, and we were gonna leave the church, and we were gonna listen to the music that we wanted to listen to. And so I think we called the preachers. I'm not sure if we called. No, we must have called them, because writing a letter would have taken way too long, and I would have repented long before that. Yeah, it would have been a call. So we called the preachers, and we said, no, we're going to withdraw our memberships. We're done now because, whatever. And they were kind of confused. I think the preacher, I don't know, it was such a random phone call. It must have been so weird to get that from kids. But he's like, okay, maybe we should have a meeting. I'm like, no, we don't want a meeting. We're good. We don't need to talk about this. No, let's get together tomorrow and talk about it. We're like, okay, we didn't have a choice, so we had to do it. So, but between that phone call and the meeting, we both repented. We're like, okay, this we can't. We went to town and we got, I don't know, I think I bought a Faith Hill CD, or a tape. I can't remember if it was a cassette or a CD at this point. It would have been still tapes, I think. Just looking back, I see a young man just hungry for some good music, and someone should have helped him get some good music. Anyway, whatever. But between that phone call and the next day, we'd already repented. We called them back, said, no, actually, we changed our minds. We don't need this meeting. We're good. We're good. But they said, no, we think we probably should still have a meeting anyway and talk about this. So we did. We had a meeting and chatted, and that was about as far as that went, but we both decided we better stay in the church. That was too close for comfort. That was a close call. We almost lost everything at that point. So, but as time went on, I really, along with my friends, we all questioned a lot. We really had a lot of questions, a lot of struggles about all the things that, as you get older, you get friends that aren't in the church, and you realize, wow, like their lives are so different. And they're doing all this stuff, and for some reason, that's just not allowed. And so we fought against, well, I don't know if we even fought against it a lot. We struggled with trying to understand it. I think overall we were decent kids. We weren't evil or doing horrible things. We just wanted to know why this was so different from everyone else's life. And then when I was close to 20, I think it was about 19, my cousin came to visit, and she had married a man from another church, and this church was called the Bible Missionary Church, and I don't know if anyone's here have heard of them. They're quite a small denomination, very rooted and based in Wesleyan theology, so more like the Methodists would have been, say, like 100 years ago. Very much second work of grace, entire sanctification, there's a lot of that. If you read John Wesley or Charles Wesley and a lot of even Salvation Army writers, very much into that theology. But she just seemed so happy, and I met her and her husband, and they were just lovely people. I hadn't seen her in years. She was quite a bit older than me. So I started going in a little town, Fraser Lake. I grew up in Vanderhoof, by the way. If anyone knows where Vanderhoof is, it's kind of, we call it the interior of BC. Down here, they do not call it the interior of BC. But we had a marker in our town that said it was the middle of BC, so I feel justified in calling it the interior still. But anyway, Fraser Lake was about 45 minutes away. Am I going way over time? I have not paid attention. Are we okay? Okay, just give me the signal when I need to stop. We can make a part 2 if we have to. But anyway, so I went to Fraser Lake one Wednesday night and went to their prayer meeting, and I really sensed something else there than what I was used to. Their worship services were a lot more, I don't know, I guess lively would be a word. They really loved singing. They had a piano in the church. The guys could wear ties, and I really wanted to wear a tie. I always wanted to do that. I never could. But it was just, there was something drawing me, and I did pray a lot about that decision. And as time went on, I would secretly keep going to their meetings because I knew if I got found out, I would be in trouble. But eventually it got to the place, and I was 20 at this point, where I knew that I wanted to go there. I wanted to be a part of what they were doing. And so instead of being found out and having a dishonorable discharge, you might say, I sent a letter to the bishop and explained my intentions and asked that I be removed from membership, so that I could, I let him know what was going on, essentially. So again, a meeting ensued. They're like, well, this is like 4 years ago, but we had another meeting, and this time it was different, though. I knew this is what I needed to do, and so we had a meeting, and they were not at all happy about this. It was very psychologically based. There was a lot of fear-based stuff, but I'd begun to kind of see through some of that at this point. And so I stuck to my guns, and I'm like, no, I'm leaving. This is what's happening. And so they finally gave up on me and said, all right. And then the other young people were instructed to stay far away from me. But what was interesting to me at that point was that the other young people that we'd always had similar questions. We'd always had similar frustrations. And for me, I was like, well, I'm going to do something about it. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to go find something else. But for them, all my friends, I think it scared them that I did that, because this church was so different from us. The women didn't wear head coverings, although they didn't cut their hair, but they didn't wear head coverings, and they were very different. They didn't make their own dresses. It was a lot of these things were very big deals for the Mennonite church. That and divorce and remarriage was a big issue. And I struggled with a lot of that, honestly. And I remember getting the concordance out and trying to study what was right and trying to figure out if it was okay to go to this church or if I was, being deceived and all this stuff. But eventually I made the move, and I told my family and I told my parents, and my dad was not happy, but at some point he said, well, if you're going to do that, then you need to go, you need to live somewhere else. So I decided then to move to Prince George, which there was another church in Prince George, the Bible Missionary Church had a church there as well. And I found work there at a little woodworking shop and made the moved to Prince George. It was difficult, but at this point I had put the radio antenna back on my car. That was another rule. You had to take your radio antennas off so that you couldn't hear the radio. We just put pop cans over, and that usually worked pretty well. But at this point I just decided, no, I'm putting the antenna back on. I was making my big bold statement. And the day before that I was moving, the weekend before I was moving, I heard a song by Rascal Flatts that I'd never heard before called I'm Moving On. And that song, I don't know if anyone here knows that song or not, it's a country song, but that song spoke to me so deeply in such a profound way, and it's always been probably one of my favorite songs since then. And it just, between that and between what I felt like God was showing me in the Bible, and between everything just working out, all the doors were opening for me to go. So I went, and it was challenging on the one level as far as leaving home. My mom really took that hard. Dad was just like, okay, this is, me and Dad never really saw eye to eye on a whole lot of stuff. We're getting better. We're slowly getting better, but it's been a long and arduous journey with that relationship. But going to the BMC, we called it the BMC, those probably first 3 or 4 years were beautiful. I absolutely loved it. It was so different. It was such a freeing experience. I could have what I felt like was a more real relationship with God, and there was vibrancy, and there was exuberance, and they did Sunday school work, and they did youth work, and there was just all these things going on that were such a delight to be a part of. And it was there that I felt they were very strong on God might call you to the ministry, or he might call you to this, or might call you to that. And I always felt that God was calling me to ministry. So they had a college, and they still do, I think, in Rock Island, Illinois, which is in the Quad Cities in Illinois. And so I decided I wanted to go to this college. Now, I don't know if you remember me saying or not about how our school only went to grade 10. But when I was 18, I had a friend of mine who had gone down to the local community college to get his grade 12. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. Like, I want to do that. I've just, for some reason, felt the pull to get my grade 12 diploma. And so another thing my dad and I did not see eye to eye on, but I decided I'm doing it anyway. I went down and I did all the courses, and it was actually a really neat experience. I really learned a lot. And why am I saying that? Oh, yes, because of this college. So thankfully, then I had my grade 12. So just before I moved to Prince George, I got my diploma. And I was so proud of the fact that I had done these courses and I had finished it and everything. And then I was able to go to college. So that was a neat thing to me, how God worked that out as well. But when I went to Bible college, it was about my second year in that, I think it was my second year, that there was, the way the dormitories were set up, there was be a room here and a room here connected by a shared bathroom and shower and such. So I was in this room, and then there was a young man moved into the room across from me. We were connected by the bathroom. And he was not BMC. At this point, I was just full on in. I didn't care what they said. I'm like, I love this church. I'm never leaving it. I found a place to build a different identity is all I had done. I kind of swapped one for another. And I didn't realize it until this other young man came in, and he had all these different ideas, and he had questions, and he would ask very hard questions of the teachers. And I'd think, oh, don't ask that. That's not like, that doesn't line up with what they're saying. Like, that's just, But then the more he would be bold and speak up, the more I began to realize he's actually got a point, like this or that or the other thing there. And then I began to question again. And I clearly remember the day I was walking back to the dormitories, and I remember realizing that the rug was getting pulled out from under my feet again. And that angered me, because I thought, how dare he disrupt my little nest? Like, I've gotten what I wanted, and that's good enough. Like, I don't want to go through all that changing stuff again. And I realized then too what my parents, or more specifically what my dad might have gone through in making the decision that he made to join the church that they did, and realizing that it's one thing to have your own life and make your own decisions, but it's quite another when you just simply are able to let someone else do that for you, take over the thinking, take over the questions and the decisions, and you can let someone else kind of create a life for you, and you just fit into that mold. And that's what I was doing. And I believe God really began opening my eyes to this fact of, yes, you can do this and it's fine, but you're still not, it still wasn't a relationship with God. It was a relationship with a church. It was a relationship with a form that I was comfortable with and that I enjoyed. And I had a girlfriend at the church there, and we would sing together, and it was really beautiful. And we ended up getting engaged actually during that year. And I was determined just to ignore this guy and his questions. I was going to do, and I'm like, no. I've got everything the way I want it. I'm good. I'm comfortable. And God seems to not like comfortable so much always. But anyway, so Sarah and I got engaged, and it wasn't more than, I'm trying to remember how long that lasted, maybe a month or so, when she wrote me a letter, and she brought it over. I was working in this sort of gatehouse of the college where students come in, you sign them in and out. And she was leaving, and she dropped off a letter, and here it was a breakup letter. She was breaking up with me, and I was like, But it was actually a relief. There was a huge part of me that was seriously relieved. Because, and this is a whole nother aspect of the story, which I'll try to cover just lightly. Growing up, I wasn't, how do I say this? I never thought about girls so much, but I had feelings, same-sex feelings, that I couldn't figure out growing up. And so that was something that was a part of me for most of my life. And what had happened is I had finally gotten the courage. I swore I never would all through my life. I swore that's something that I don't understand. I don't know what that is, but I'm leaving it alone. Around 18 is when I started hearing words like gay and stuff like that, that I assumed that must be what I am. And but I still I wasn't comfortable with that, and I knew that wasn't the right thing. So I would keep on just like, no, if I can just get married to the right girl, everything's good, everything's golden. Right? Like there you go. So, but what had happened was my girlfriend's grandfather was actually the bishop of the church. And at one camp meeting, I I was really seeking this experience of sanctification. I spent most of my life seeking the experience, or most of my time there seeking this experience. And in this church, we had altars, so the altar became my place. Every time there was a revival meeting, I was in that altar all the time, up and down. But it was because of this issue, and I finally got the courage to go and talk to him about it. And I hope and pray that my experience in life has brought me to a point of not being so afraid to discuss an issue like this, because I feel like we're living in a time where this issue needs to be discussed, and people need to understand the danger and the deceit of this issue. But when I went to speak to him, and no disrespect, but I think he was uncomfortable with it, and I finally got it off my chest, and I told him what was going on. And I thought this was the last stronghold to being filled with the Spirit and forever living a perfect sin-free life, which is kind of what was touted, that you could be sin-free. And I thought, well, this is the one thing that is my deepest shame. I need to talk to someone about this. And so I finally did. I talked to the bishop about it. And I got one sentence in response, and that response was, well, I'll be praying for you. And then he walked away. And I was shocked. Shocked and severely, I felt like let down. I really honored this man. He was what I can, and I'm sure he is a very good man. I'm not throwing stones at all, but I think it was a tough thing for it to talk about, and it is a tough thing to talk about. And you're not accustomed to it. He was older, not accustomed to this sort of conversation, and so that threw me for a bit of a loop. And I thought, well, maybe it's not that big of a deal. I don't know. Like maybe that's all there is to it. Maybe I'll just some prayers and we'll be good. Although I'd done a lot of praying for the first, I was probably 25, 26 at this point when this conversation took place. So I thought, well, okay, we'll leave it at that. So I left it at that. But the thing was, now he knew, and I was dating his granddaughter. So now we have an issue. And I never told her. I that was the only person I talked to about it. She knows now, but we're not together though. But another long story. But anyway, so I go back to Bible college that fall. That was my second year. I was only there for 2 years. That was my second year. I went back to Bible college, and I thought, okay, well, this issue's behind me. I've talked to it. But then I'm sitting in theology class one day, and there's a knock on the door, and there's like, oh, there's a phone for you, Ben. I'm like, oh, okay. So I go to the phone, and here it's my pastor from back home, and he says, we've heard something. And so what he had heard was the past summer or maybe even the summer before, I can't remember how long, no, it was the summer before, it was quite a while before that, I had house sat for someone who was friends of people in the church, and they had the internet, and this was my first time with access to the internet. And in my own, of course, I found things on the internet that I didn't even know existed, but it didn't help my feelings that I was having at all. In fact, it made it a lot worse, because as you can imagine, what I was looking up wasn't exactly Christian. And then, of course, I realized this was my first kind of internet experience. And then I realized I've got to somehow delete this history, because what if they can go back and see what's happening on the internet? So I was asking a friend at work just casually, like, say you'd want to delete something on internet. Like, what would you do? How would you go about doing that? And so they told me, and I was like, okay, good. So I ran back, and I was deleting. But what I didn't realize is that she had caught her husband watching pornography. And so she had installed one of these things that, like, track where you go, even if you delete it. So she saw all of it. And of course, she told the pastor's daughter, who then told the pastor, and here's me on the phone in theology class talking about this. But I thought, okay, good, I've been busted. At this point, I was kind of ready to be busted. I was really tired of this issue. And I explained to him what I had my conversation with the bishop and how we'd had that conversation. And that made him feel a bit better. And I think he called the bishop and they had a conversation. And so they were, I don't really know what I don't know, they just didn't kick me out, I guess, was the main thing. I was able to continue. But that really, things were starting to get ruffled, and things were starting to really shake me up, and the issue wasn't going away. And when the bishop found out that I was engaged then to his granddaughter, he had a call, and he said, well, when you come home from school, we need to have a chat about this. And I was like, oh no, because I know that I'm nowhere where he wants me to be, for sure, internally. Still having feelings, still struggling with that stuff. And so when she broke up with me, that's my point of this whole story. When she broke up with me, the relief was in large part due to not having to go home and having that chat with the bishop, because that's not a chat I wanted to have. And what she later explained is she felt that God was asking her to break up with me. I feel like we were very much in love. She was what I would still consider to be my one true love in my life. It was wonderful, wonderful. She was a beautiful, wonderful girl. Very pure relationship. There was never anything improper. We were very much, the church is very strict on no sex before marriage and no physical contact or anything like that. So it was a good, wholesome relationship. But she just felt that God wanted her to break up with me, and so. But the whole situation disrupted me a lot. It pulled on my roots, and I began to feel very disenchanted with everything, with the church, with all of it. Because at school, the entire way through school was very much like me at an age of 8. I was constantly under what we then considered the conviction of the Holy Spirit, what I now consider to just be fear of. I'm not even sure what that fear was, but it was a deep-rooted fear of I don't have what they say we're having, because all these preachers are saying they've been sin-free for 30-some years and they have all these beautiful testimonies, and I'm like, I can't stay sin-free for a week, never mind 30 years. Like, I could never do this. And so it became very stressful, and of course, we had revival meetings at school, usually every couple months. Like, it was very frequent. It was always chapel, prayer, Bible study, very focused on that. So I spent most of my time, again, in the altar seeking God and trying to find perfection in some level or another. But after that year, I went home. I was thoroughly disenchanted with all of it. And eventually, I remember a dear friend of mine at school telling me, just finish. Just do your last 2 years, get your degree, and then at least you've got it. And I really wish I had. I truly wish I had. But I think it would have, I don't know, it might not have been the right choice. Whatever the case, I did not go back. I stayed at home. I still went to the local church, but things had changed. My pastor and I didn't have the friendship that we had before, because now, of course, there was this other information brought to light, and things had shifted. And eventually, after some time, I think after a year or so, I started dating a different girl, and it was, based on the pastor's advice as well. Like, if you can just marry the right girl, I think that was their mentality too, then all this will go away and everything will be wonderful, fine. And so started dating a different girl, and we got engaged for 3 weeks. That was the most miserable 3 weeks of my life, so I broke up with her. And it just wasn't at all, it was just me trying to fix myself. It had nothing to do with a relationship. It had nothing to do with truly loving someone. So I'm glad that I did break up with her, but that was also a very difficult decision. Her family probably still hates me to this day. No, maybe not. I don't know. It was a long time ago. She's married and has a beautiful family now. But still, at that point, I was almost 28, and I went to the pastor and his wife, and I told them about this, and they were quite upset. And that was it for me. I said, no more. I'm done with church. I'm leaving church. And my pastor at that point made a statement that stuck with me for my whole life and angered me for many years. I was very angry at this statement, but now I think he was absolutely on point. But what he said to me, he said, you've just never truly died to yourself. And why it angered me was because I'd spent all those years in the altar, praying, seeking, doing nothing but trying to die to myself. But I think he was absolutely right. There was never a death to self. It was never a connection or a relationship to Christ. It was always about, how can I possibly try to be good enough so that God will accept me and give me this experience or make me perfect. And so that, of course, becomes such a heavy burden that I think I was experiencing some type of burnout where I just couldn't go along any further. So I stopped going to church. I said, enough of that. I'm leaving. And so I went to Australia, did something radical, and went to the other ends of the earth for almost a year, which was a great experience, actually. I learned a lot in Australia. I still read my Bible. I was still quite conservative. I was working on this cattle station in the middle of the desert in the outback, because I always wanted to go to the outback. And of course, the station owners, they would drink, of course. Like, beer drinking it's an Australian staple, essentially. And they were so befuddled by the fact that I wouldn't drink, and I usually just stayed in my little home. I didn't really want to go anywhere. I found a little home group, actually, a little Christian home group, where I'd once in a while go to church and read the Bible with them. But it was not the same. I just didn't feel any connection to anything anymore. And my last weekend in Australia, before I came home, I finally had my first drink. It took me until then. And my boss, he just shook his head. He's like, you waited this whole time? He's like, we've been having so much fun all these years, or this whole year, and now you finally have a drink and you're about to leave. But I remember taking a sip of that first beer and clearly feeling like I crossed the line. This is it. Like, Anyway, I stepped over the line. This is it for me. And it was I largely ignored the feeling, but it was there. It was there. And I'm not saying that it's evil to drink a beer. Whatever. That's not the point of this. The point of this was growing up, it was such a big deal that drinking to me was like, no, you never go there. That's just one thing you don't do. And I wasn't a drinker and a partier. I had friends that left the Mennonites who, that's all they wanted to do was do drugs and go to movies and go to the bar. And I just never wanted that. I wanted to find something real. So, but, yeah, after that, life became a little more about alcohol. Not extremely so. I don't know that I would have ever considered myself an alcoholic, but do alcoholics consider themselves that? I'm not sure. Maybe not until they reach a point of correction. But I spent some time. Let's see. I moved back home. Here's the other thing I did after that. I still wanted to go to school. I desperately wanted to go to school, and I wanted to study music. So I decided I'm going to Bob Jones University, which is in South Carolina, of all places. I don't know if you've heard of Bob Jones University, anybody? But it's a very Baptist theological type of school. I lasted one semester. I went to this school. The music part was great. I was part of some beautiful choirs, like absolutely stunning. I couldn't, like, the perfection demanded in music was right down my alley because I still loved perfection. Like, if you're not going to do it right, my rule was if you're not going to be perfect and do it right, then just don't even bother doing it at all. So that applied to my music as well, and I was very demanding on myself for that. And in part I don't mind because I still love singing. But I've realized that it's okay to be human about it as well. You can miss a note if you need to. It's not going to end your life or hurt anyone. But that was not the case. For me, it was, no, you're perfect or you just don't. But yeah, but there too, I was continuing deeper into my depression there because we had to go to one of the Baptist churches on Sundays. So I'd go to these churches. Felt zero connection. I didn't like any of it. I couldn't understand the doctrine, the theology. I wasn't connected to anyone there. I was very much my own little island. Even though I was on a campus of thousands of people, I'd never been on such a huge campus. It blew my mind how big it was. But I spent basically the whole time either singing or my piano lessons and voice lessons or sitting in my room watching movies. I realized I could rent Netflix and they would send me CDs or send me DVDs and I could watch movies. So I really didn't study at all. I just watched movies and sang music, and then when it came to test time, I crammed as much as possible and somehow passed. But it wasn't a fulfilling experience, and after that, I sort of lost all interest in any of that. I went back home and I went back to BC, came back to BC, I guess that's where we are now, and ended up deciding to move to Ontario. So I moved to Ontario. I feel this morning talking about John Mark in Sunday school, how he was a flake. I'm like, yeah, I can relate to that. I feel flakier than a bowl of cornflakes. And it's just just constantly moving and shifting and trying to find some purpose and direction. And so in Ontario, I attended church for a little bit with a group that my friend was part of, very radical group, very, very radical, dangerously radical. And I was there for a little bit. And then, I couldn't anymore. I couldn't do church. But the problem for me was that church and God and all that was my identity, so I didn't know how to be outside of that. And I remember writing a poem about being in the space between worlds. Like there was this world that I came from, and then this world that existed out here somewhere that I didn't understand any of it. And I was just in that space in between. And to me, that's how I lived my life, was in that space between worlds. But eventually I moved a bit to London, and then ended up in Toronto, where I stayed for another 5 years. And in Toronto was where, of course, I allowed my baser nature to take over. Toronto, you can do anything you want, of course, and that was where more of the darker things happened. But even there, I think back to that, and I just see God keeping me through all of that. I wasn't with God, but God was with me still. So, yeah. Where am I in my notes? Let's see. So Toronto, yes. So after that was only, let's see, I left Toronto when I was 35, so that's not that long ago. I'm 42 now. But when I left Toronto to go north, I was working as a meat cutter most of this time. My dad had a butcher shop, and I realize I'm speaking to vegetarians, so I apologize. As I was rehearsing this, I'm like, oh no, like they're vegetarian. I was a butcher for so many years. We grew up doing that. We butchered chickens and cows and all that stuff. And if you ever go to Vanderhoof, just before you get to Vanderhoof on Highway 16 on your left-hand side, about 5 kilometers out of town, you'll see a big blue building, and it says the Country Locker. I think it's still there. I think it is. And that was my dad's shop, the shop that he built when I was in my teens, and we worked there, and he eventually sold that there. That's another story. But anyway, so as a butcher then, I found this job. I came back from, where was I? Oh, that's right, 2016. So there were a few times in the period between 2008 and 2016 that I would give church another try. And it wouldn't last long. I'd be there for a bit and become disenchanted and leave. But 2016, I decided to really, I'm like, okay, no, church is where I need to be. I need to find a church. And so I found this, I can't remember what it was called, like a community church or something in Toronto. And I'd go there and decided, you know what I need to do is I need to go visit my parents. So at this point, my parents had moved to Bolivia as missionaries for their church, which is where my dad still is. My mom passed recently, but my dad's still there and with some siblings as well. So I decided I needed to go to Bolivia and see my parents and maybe try to mend that relationship, and maybe that would then fix everything. So I went for 2 months. I decided to go for 2 months. Crazy. I lasted 2 months, but I was there for 3 days before I realized that 3 days was long enough. Like, I wanted to not be there anymore because I was going to their church, which was the same as what I grew up in. And wow, that was tough. And it was good that I was there 2 months because my dad and I had some conversations, but none of them ended well. It was not a pleasant experience overall. But after that, I didn't really know what to do. So I went back to Toronto where I'd been living and I remember going on the computer and looking at Google Maps because I love traveling. And I thought, I just want to look at Google Maps and just imagine going somewhere. I need somewhere to go. And I looked up at Northern Canada because I've always been curious about Northern Canada. So I looked at the Northwest Territories and I found this town that was right close to the Arctic Ocean, about as far away as I could get from everything. And it was called Inuvik. I'm like, I wonder what Inuvik's like. So I'm looking at Google Images and all this stuff. Well, wouldn't you know it, a few days later, I get an email from the Northwest Company responding to a resume that I'd submitted, I don't even know when, a long time before that. And when I was looking for a job, I guess, apparently, I'd actually kind of forgotten about the whole thing. And here they were asking me if I wanted to go cut meat for them in Northern Canada. And I was like, well, sure, let's do that. That sounds fun. And so I applied, and it took about 3 months. There was a lot of interviews, a lot of physicals, and all these things I had to go through. And it was a process. It took a long time. I remember being very frustrated with that. But I just felt like I needed something. And at this point, spiritually, I was studying atheism. I thought maybe atheism has the answer for me, which no, I couldn't be a logical person and study atheism. It didn't make any sense to me at all. But I was trying to find something and just casting about, like the flakiness of it all. But wouldn't you know it, when they finally get through to giving me a job offer, she calls me and says, we're going to send you to Inuvik. I was like, what? But something in me already knew that. But the cool thing was too, that very weekend that they called with a job offer was when my current job told me we're shutting shop. You have to find something else. You either have to go work somewhere else, or maybe we can try to fit you in somewhere where they weren't sure. So they were closing the doors. So it worked out really well. And so I thought, well, this is perfect and it's meant to be. So I went to Inuvik, and that was in 2016. And when I got there, they put me into a 3-bedroom house all by myself. And I'd never lived in such a big house by myself. Like, growing up, we had a big house, but after that, it was apartments in Toronto. It was shared accommodations and just awful. Well, not awful, but not great living experiences. And so they put me in this 3-bedroom house by myself, right next to work. It was a perfect little opportunity, or a perfect little thing, and I just loved it that I had my own space. So finally, I got to sing again. So I'd been singing some through the years, but I'd never found my own voice by myself. I was always too scared to sing in front of people too much, because then they would hear me and judge me and all this stuff. Like, if I was on stage performing, that was one thing. I did some of that in Toronto, but I'd never really found my own voice by myself. I was always kind of scared to hear the sound of my own voice. So in that house, I downloaded some karaoke apps, and every day after work, I'd go and I'd sing and sing and sing and sing for hours. It was so fun. But it was good because no one could hear me. The road was far away. I kept the windows closed and make sure no one could hear me. And it was such a feeling of, I'd always wondered what I was supposed to do with my life. In Toronto, I was very depressed because I had no idea what I was supposed to do with my life. I hated being a butcher. I really did. I didn't love it. I hated it, but I just needed the paycheck, so I had to do it. But when I began singing, I suddenly realized one day that question is not there anymore. This expression, I don't know if it's necessarily just singing, but that expression, that ability to hear myself without judgment and hear my voice and allow that to be there, suddenly the question of what am I doing with my life just evaporated. and I'd sing these songs and I'd cry, and it was a good experience. But on a spiritual side, I was very much still feeling completely empty. I'd cry myself to sleep most nights just because I felt so much like if I wasn't a Christian or if I wasn't in some kind of a church, then who was I? I had no identity outside of that. And I saw a meme where it was a statue, or someone had made a sculpture, and it was this man. It was just his head and shoulders, and then a little bit going down the side, I guess, to support the head and shoulders, and then the bottom half. But the middle, the torso, was completely empty. And I thought, that's me, just empty. And it was tough, but I think going through that, it was about 3 years of going through that depression and going through that complete loss of identity, helped me to reset, or helped God to reset me, really, because I, at this point, had lost faith in everything. And I would read some Eckhart Tolle and listen to Wayne Dwyer and do some inspirational speakers here and there on YouTube and such. But it was very, very empty. And I felt like, later I heard the expression, the dark night of the soul, and I'm like, that felt like a dark night to me very much so. And eventually then, I was offered a grant to record an album. I'd applied to the Northwest Territories. They have an arts program that they give grants to help you record an album. So they offered me this grant, and they said, you can record it wherever you want. And I thought, well, I don't just want to record it in my, if I have the money to do it, I want to do it right. I want to go to a studio and do a proper album. It's not a proper album, but you can hear it someday if you'd like. I'm not proud of it. But it was... They're all my own songs, though. But so I decided then, my friend was living in Vancouver Island. That's what brought me to Vancouver Island, was there was a studio in Nanaimo, and I was like, okay, I can move there, and I can make my album, and this will be my big break, and I'll become a huge recording artist, and the whole world will love me finally, and I'll have found my purpose. Didn't quite go that way, but I did get my album recorded, which was good, but that's what brought me to Vancouver Island. And then in 2021, and I'm trying to wrap this up here, we're almost at 1 o'clock, I apologize. In 2021, I had an experience. I'd been getting into meditation a lot and just sitting still and going inward and just trying to find myself. And I had an experience that lasted for about a week and a half that was the most profound experience that I've ever had in my life. And I remember thinking during that time, like, if this is what they mean by being born again, I thought, okay, this is it. But what it was, I don't know what the experience really was, but I had this intense euphoria that lasted for about a week and a half. I lost all my inhibition. I lost all my fear. I'd go to work and I'd sing in front of people, which was unheard of for me. I was too scared to do that. But there was something that changed in me. Something opened up in me, it felt like. And it was like I could see things in a different way. And that's kind of the only way I can explain it. It was a very intense, what I considered a spiritual experience. But then about a week and a half, that went on for about a week and a half. And I remember when you were talking, Burk, about your testimony and how God's presence or that feeling can be addictive, because I feel like there was something there to do with God. And I don't know for sure all what it was, but it was nothing that like I've ever experienced before. It was incredible. And I wanted to stay in that experience. I didn't want to ever lose that. It was amazing. But I did. It's kind of just faded away. It kind of just went away. But about a week and a half after that, I met someone, a man. And we decided to get into a relationship. We moved together, lived in Nanaimo, and we were together for 16 months. But what happened, the reason that's even significant is because at the end of that, the way that ended was so earth-shattering for me. It broke me all to pieces. It ripped at the very core roots of my trauma of even needing to be in a relationship like that. And it broke me. I had no idea how painful something like that could be. But what it did, looking back, what it did do was I believe God was beginning to uproot that trauma in me that needed to be in a same-sex relationship, and was helping me to understand that this isn't a life sentence. Because after that, it kind of just broke off. Not fully. It took some time, but over time, that just began to break off, and I began to honestly look at myself and understand some things surrounding all this, and I'll kind of leave it at that. But what that did then, after that happened, I talked to the Northwest company, and they said, well, if you want to come back and work for us, you can, because I was broke. I'd been living with him. I had nothing, and I was just out on the street. And so I needed something. I needed to make money. I needed a place to live, kind of stat. I was staying with my cousin at the time. I had to get rid of my dog because she had a dog and a cat, and they did not cohabitate well together. It was a bit of a traumatic experience. So I went back up north. They talked to the Northwest company. They said, sure, we got work. They always have work. And so I went to Northern Ontario at this point then. And it was just a 6-month contract because I knew I didn't want to stay there, and I knew how much I hated cutting meat. I'd kind of stopped at this point. I'd kind of stopped cutting meat, and I think I was done cutting meat for a couple of years, and it was so nice not to have to do that. But here I felt myself kind of being forced back into that, so I did it, and it was just as horrible as I remembered it ever being. I didn't enjoy it at all, but it did give me a job, and it gave me a place to live, and for which I'm thankful. However, 6 months later, then. I was talking to my foster sister here in Grinrod, and she's like, well, why don't you come and live with it? There's a trailer on the yard. We got space here. So that ended up, my contract was about over, and I told my boss there, I said, I don't care what you hear from me, if you ever hear from me again, but do not hire me back. Just don't. Even if I want a job, don't ever let me come back here, because I hate this. And it made me so miserable, like on a deep level. My soul was feeling, like it was just, I'd go to work and it was just awful. Like I knew that I should stop cutting meat for now and forever. So, deep down as a vegetarian, I still eat meat sometimes. No, and I imagine if I was starving and I had to go butcher a deer to eat, I could do it, but it wouldn't be enjoyable. It would be for a matter of survival, which I guess is kind of what it always was anyway. But anyway, so that brought me here, and there's so much more that I thought maybe I'd put in, but I feel like the way it's come out is I'm going to trust Jesus that that's the way it's meant to come out. And I got here and I got a job at Surecrop and met David, and I guess the rest is kind of history, but. This is the other thing I want to close with this. Talking about betrayal. Excuse me. I think I was reading, actually when Burk asked me to do this, I thought, I woke up the next morning and just thought, how can I do that? Like, how will they believe in me? How will they ever, like, if they hear my story, they're going to be like, wow, you're a flake. Like, yeah, absolutely am. But then God brought to my mind that they don't need to believe in you. This really not it's your prerogative, and they really don't need to believe anything. Jesus is the one that we should believe in. But then also that morning I was reading in the Gospels. I've been reading through the Gospels. I've been going on a bit of a 40-day quest of getting to know Jesus, so I decided reading through the Gospels would be a good way to do that. And in the book of, I was in Mark, that's right, the very end of Mark. Well, we're actually not the end, but where God says, Peter, you're going to betray me 3 times. And that felt that resonated with me. That Peter said no. He said never, never, never. I'll never do that. And that used to be me. I'd go to these church services and pray and commit everything to God. And we had to read the Martyr's Mirror as a kid, so people would die, and we're like, I'll for sure die for God. That's no problem. I'm so devoted. But the slightest bit of adversity comes along, and poof, there I go. And read just like Peter, how before the cock crew 3 times, before the rooster crew 3 times, or before the rooster crew twice, he denied Christ 3 times, and he absolutely did that. And I thought what that must have been like for him to go through his ministry knowing how heavily and assuredly he had betrayed Christ. And even for Paul, going through his ministry, realizing that he had been killing Christians, he had been so decidedly against that no one should ever believe a word they say. And that comes back to that it's Christ through us. And if Christ isn't doing the work, it's going to fall apart. It says that somewhere in the Word too. And I thought this morning I was reading in, it was the beginning of Luke, where Zechariah is singing I don't know if he's singing, but he made this prophecy for his son John, and he talks about the light that comes into us so that we can light the world. And I've been thinking a lot about the moon and the sun, and how the moon has no light of its own, but it's the sun shining on the moon that the moon then reflects back to us in darkness when we're in the nighttime. And that's to me now what God has done for me through this whole period. And there's a whole other thing I'd like to talk about, but I'm not going to take the time. But how God has led me into a personal relationship, into get away from all the religion, all the stuff that so easily clouds you up. It's about you and Jesus right now. It's about you and God. And so yeah, I feel like if I can be a moon reflecting the light of the sun, that's enough. That's all I need, because it's the sun's light. It's not my own. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for listening. I apologize if I've been scattered, or if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about all of it. I don't care. Some of it might not be good for the pulpit, but if you ever, if you need to know more, you can ask me, and I'll happily share more with you. God bless you all.
Well, now you got to listen to my sermon. No. Oh, that's good. Oh, I appreciate that. And you know, it's an ongoing journey with the Lord, eh? And He has to do the work in our lives. And it's a work of freedom. That's what I really like, eh? It's so many things that we've lost through sin that He wants to restore to us. Anyway, let's just... I'll just say the benediction. I think maybe we'll just stand up and I'll say the benediction. Father in heaven, we're so thankful that for the plan of salvation. We're so thankful that you are who you are, that you care about us and love us and pursue us and change us. And we're looking forward to heaven. But we're so thankful that we can be with you right now. We thank you that you want to live in our lives, that you want to give us stuff that we don't have so that we can taste the things of heaven. And so we just thank you as we heard the story of you working with this young man. And we just pray and realize that you can work with us and take us home. And so we want to thank you for that this morning. Praise your name. Be with us in the coming weeks. Help us to share. There's so many people that are looking and need you so desperately and don't even maybe know it. And so bless us with the power of your Spirit. Thank you that we could be here this morning. We ask this also bless the food that's going to be provided here. And may your blessings of your Spirit be with us as we spend time together. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.